Annette, thank you. I couldn't have been introduced by anybody I would have wanted more. Thank you. Some time ago now, my dear friend and colleague Alison Lee told me about the time she was visiting the United States and she was walking on Venice Beach with one of our intellectual heroes. The talk had turned personal and he'd asked her about her background, explaining that she'd grown up in Burnie, Tasmania, and describing what it was like living there all her formative years before heading to university in Hobart and then off to Germany on scholarship. He interrupted her and he said, "How could someone like you come from somewhere like that?" Alison's response was immediate, and it was why she was even telling me this story. She told him that she had had incredible teachers. With that small anecdote setting the scene, let me now begin this lecture by simultaneously acknowledging country and engaging the question. I would be surprised if there's anyone in this conference who does not acknowledge country in all public gatherings. It's something I thought I've been good at, actually, for many years now, but it's something that what I've usually done is suddenly no longer good enough in the common sense of that phrase. Things have changed in this country. Since the 2017 Uluru Declaration, for me to acknowledge country in a way that is good enough in the sense that I want to explore here this afternoon, of extending but not directing my listeners towards a predetermined outcome, means my practice has to change. The Uluru Declaration challenged my world and it changed my worldview. As I acknowledge country today and pay respects to the Gadigal people and their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their work as its traditional owners, I also want to publicly remind myself that this land is, was and always will be Gadigal because it was taken from them without consent, without treaty and without compensation. When the British settlers arrived in this land, what they began is something that we are still dealing with. As Mark McKenna has said this year, even our acknowledgements contain silences. While it might be quite good enough, in one sense, for me to keep acknowledging country in the way that I always have, it is not now good enough in the sense that I want for my students. If I am being good enough for my students, I cannot maintain such silences, even if, by filling them, I might provoke what Deborah Britzman calls some awful thoughts, with effects that I actually can't control. And in my talk this afternoon, I hope to explain why the idea of being good enough for students, rather than for systems, should be the goal for teacher education. I thank you, Annette, and I thank AARE, and gratefully acknowledge the honour that you've given me in allowing me to actually share these ideas with you this afternoon. In honouring Bill Radford, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised to find that so many of the ideas that I'm going to be exploring today can be traced right back to Bill Radford's doctoral research, begun when he was a teacher in a small rural secondary school, Bairnsdale. And I know some of you have connections with Bairnsdale as well. Radford's PhD was concerned with a set of silences too. They were the result of effects he observed at Bairnsdale inside an education system dominated by what he called back then an urban outlook. And his study clearly demonstrated the differences in opportunity available to the children who grew up in rural Australia compared with those in the city. In introducing Radford's published thesis, Ken Cunningham, who was at that point the director of ACER, 1939 I think this was, made the following observation. What appears to me to be the most vital conclusion arising from Mr. Radford's study is the indispensability, first, of securing teachers who are capable of studying their local environment in the spirit employed by the author, and secondly, of encouraging them to put into operation the results of their findings. This may involve higher standards of training and some revision of methods of administration. But the importance of this issue is surely great enough to warrant such changes. The talk of higher standards of training and revision of administrative methods is a challenge that I've been committed to for over 20 years now, although it's not at all hard to see that it's been with very little success. But minds can be changed, and I still have hope that through working in the country, at the margins, unpicking the edges, and arguing the need for teachers who are not only good, but actually good enough to practice outside of the predefined metrocentric standardised urban framework that characterises teacher standards today, that changes at the centre might be affected. The presentation will address the challenge that Radford was making in his dissertation, the challenge to foreground the need for teachers to be prepared to acknowledge, understand, and be capable of responding to difference in school classrooms wherever they're located. I'm not confining my argument to the rural, rather I do want to make a larger point in response to the persistence of educational inequity in this nation, that the potential to change our minds about teacher education is available to us, and that we must harness and use it in the interests of the young people that we are responsible to serve. I will argue today that education researchers and professionals are now in a position to see beyond the crisis in teacher education that has once again this year been whipped up into a frenzy by the ATAR whisk. I want to claim space for the redevelopment of strong, knowledge-based theories and practices of teacher education that can take us forward with renewed energy. As researchers, we need to mobilise our intellectual resources to address our colleagues in the field, our deans, our vice-chancellors, our university managers, as well as our systems and school colleagues. Our goal must be to generate some effective self-talk about the place, nature, and role of teacher education in this country. It is never too late. In 2009, Raewyn Connell argued that we are in possibly a decisive moment where the neoliberal agenda and the control mechanisms have gained a grip on schooling, but do not yet have complete control. That was 2009. She raised questions then about what is meant by a good teacher, saying that although this is a significant practical question, it is also important conceptually, since ideas about good teaching are embedded in the design of educational institutions and lurk in our talk about curricula, educational technology, and school reform. To accept that the decisive moment has passed and that teacher education as a field has been domesticated is to accept that we are powerless to take and make an intellectual and ethical stance. After all, as John Hattie has said very recently, at present teacher education is little more than a cottage industry, an apprenticeship rather than a profession, and it's devoid of debate about the effect of teacher education programs on student learning. But we are now seeing the results not of our inaction, but of our compliance in the neoliberal self-governance of teacher education. And so we are able to engage this debate. It's not easy to change cultures of performativity and demoralisation, of course. And as I argued in my 2010 presidential address to AARE, the relatively low status of education and the very low status of teacher education within universities makes it even harder to influence institutional and sometimes even faculty level policy. I'm suggesting that we should entertain what is undeniably another awful thought in Britzman's sense, one that explicitly addresses acute worries that teachers have that education is not synonymous with control and mastery. This awful thought is the idea of a good enough teacher education, one that explicitly aims to produce what I am calling a good enough teacher. In this conception, such a person is much more than a certifiably assessed good teacher at any agreed national standard. Rather, she is someone who possesses what I've recently called the humility to know that she can never be fully prepared for the schools of today and tomorrow, who is certain that she is not classroom ready when she enters her first school, and who knows that her role is to struggle every day to come to know the needs of her students so that they can be met. As a good enough teacher, her teacher education will have prepared her, though, to have confidence in her ability to find out and to integrate what she needs to know about her students with her understandings of the purpose of education and with her always extending experience. She will know how to do her best for the children in the classroom rather than for the metrics by which her system will be assessed. As education researchers, we know that she can never do the same thing for every student in every classroom, every time. As teacher educators, we must support her to know it too, rather than believe that she must conform to current representations of the good teacher, someone who looks to data to inform her teaching, rather than Montessori-like to the child. We might then allow her to develop the self-reliance she needs as what has been called an organic professional, with the capacity to learn in, from, and through her practice, in line with theories of the development of expertise. It's an interesting term, good enough. It has the vernacular meaning that I used at the start, of course, which detracts from its conceptual and critical value, leaking into common sense reactions that allow its theoretical strength to be easily dismissed. To show you the problem with this, here's Ken Zeichner reporting on a passionate exchange that he had about teacher education last year. The vernacular meaning of good enough is already mobilised pejoratively in our field. Zeichner is talking about a former director of the Institute of Educational Sciences standing up and yelling at him at a symposium. He said that we can never expect a high level of academic preparation for 3.6 million teachers, so we just need to script everything for them. He used the term good enough teachers. That was Ken Zeichner, got angry and said something about good enough only being good enough for other people's children. When I asked him about his kids' teachers, he got very angry at me and had to be restrained. Yet this is fundamentally the same argument I am making here. And this is why you see it might really be an awful thought for us to engage with, because the idea of the good enough teacher, as I'm using it, really does challenge us to change our thinking. It is originally a psychoanalytic term developed by Donald Winnicott. A good enough teacher education, using Winnicott's concept, is far more than near enough to meet predefined standards. It has a precise and extremely useful meaning that I'm arguing is precisely what we might need at this point in time to be able to reconceive teacher education to meet the challenge of change. And in fact, to understand that being good enough for other people's children is probably the hardest thing that any teacher can hope to be. From that introductory section, then the talk's divided into three parts. I will begin by attempting first to explain and answer the question of what's good enough in terms of teachers and teacher education. Then I will argue that Winnicott's ideas, in association with new theories of practice, give us a strong way of rethinking the impossible situation of teacher education and perhaps changing our minds about possible solutions. Finally, I will address the challenge of what a good enough practice in teacher education might be like. Picking up on Radford's early research in particular, I'll be thinking in terms of its attention to difference and diversity and the prioritisation of the situated materiality of practice over idealised representations of teachers' work. I hope I will leave you with a sense of the challenges we need to meet as educational researchers in order to ensure that our work matters in improving the education and life chances of the children we ultimately serve. The idea of a good enough teacher education is taken from Donald Winnicott, as I said, a British psychoanalyst who proposed the idea of a good enough mother back in 1953. Winnicott was working at that time in response to traumatised children during and after World War II in England, and responding also to popular views in the post-war baby boom that good mothers shared certain selfless characteristics, promulgated perhaps in response to the need to keep them all at home in the nuclear family and out of a demobilised workforce. Perhaps not surprisingly too, the circulation of these discourses often resulted in negative psychological effects in the mothers who failed to achieve the impossible idea of perfect mothering, all sanitised and formula fed at that time. With my own mother having failed absolutely and gone back to work in order to save her sanity before I was even 2 months old, and leaving me in the quite good enough hands of my grandmother, and with me growing up to be a teacher, I obviously wasn't beautiful, growing up to be a teacher rather than a psychoanalyst, I hadn't thought too much about these claims and these ideas until a colleague and doctoral student, Diane Bloomfield, who many of you will know, introduced the concept of a good enough teacher educator in her 2006 dissertation about pre-service teachers. Following Winnicott's own extension of his model of the mother-child relationship to explore the relationship between therapist and client, highlighting how both require a movement from dependence towards independence and also separation, the idea of good enough mothers, therapists, and for Bloomfield, teacher educators, is convincing. Good enough mothers are identified and defined as preparing their children for what they need, the capacity to prosper when they're not there. The mothers aren't there. Like other ideas whose time may have come, the notion of good enough is increasingly being taken up around the world in the mundane forms of popular psychology, but it is also being taken seriously in the literature related to other messy human professions like government, management, medicine, and allied healthcare. But it is often misunderstood, and you can see why. And I suspect it's probably been just a bit too awful in the face of repeated criticisms of our field to be able to suggest it until now as a serious direction for the serious business of teacher education. Bloomfield argued compellingly that there are 3 aspects of Winnicott's mother-child model that support the conceptualisation of a good enough teacher education. The first of these is the significance of a transitional or potential space between mother and child, which encourages the child to search for self through imaginative or creative play. For teacher education, the potential space is the teacher education course, an intellectual and practice space which can provide the opportunity for students to bring and connect their own experience with the professional knowledge of the field in the study of education and the study of teaching. Second, Winnicott indicates the importance of a sense of safety that the mother provides by setting boundaries and providing support. This allows the child to try out different senses of self in the transitional space. In teacher education, I see this as most obviously possible is in the practice space of professional experience in schools. Yet Pam Grossman's work on core practices of teaching and the range of post-structuralist theories of practice elaborated by Green, Shatsky, Kemmis, the Dreyfus brothers, along with the work of Noble and Watkins, have provided me with a very strong basis for rethinking current practice in this area. Most of this work highlights the importance of the body and of course-based practice in the development of what can be called a teaching habitus after Bourdieu. And there is significant potential following the Dreyfus theory of the situated development of ethical expertise, for this transitional space to be highlighted as a recurring, continuous, recursive space of professional growth throughout the life of a teacher. This can only happen, however, if teachers do not see themselves, if teacher education does not see them as already preformed, ready when they leave it. This is the third point that Bloomfield highlighted from Winnicott's work. The good enough mother understands she's imperfect and that she's ultimately unable to shield her child from the world or prepare it for anything that it's likely to meet in life. The resonances with teaching and teacher education are clear. And while it seems to me to be an obvious motif for teacher education as a field, we do not yet seem to be able to understand that we shouldn't try to be perfect either. Rather, teacher education appears to have internalised all the external criticisms that continually publicise our failure and cause us to lurch from one crisis to another. As Deborah Britzman writes, from the outside, we have crises and descriptions of what's wrong with our field. From the inside, too many problems are posed as in need of either an adequate knowledge base or the proper taxonomy. Then what follows is an uncanny sense of timelessness, packaged under the idea and sign of readiness. A good enough teacher education accepts that perfection is impossible. This is its strength and its purpose. And this is why I believe, even if it is an awful thought, it is so powerful as a concept for teacher education to take up. The discourse of crisis, of attacks on our field from the outside, provokes reactionary responses from the field itself, particularly from those who manage the institutional field in higher education. What would be the effects if teacher education were to accept that it's not perfect, that it cannot be perfect, and argue strongly that it must not be perfect if it is ever to be good enough? What if it lets go of the impossible ideal? As Bill Green highlighted in his 2009 Radford address, Sigmund Freud, a psychoanalyst much more famous than Donald Winnicott, characterised education as an impossible profession. Like governance and psychoanalysis, it can only ever be ultimately unsatisfactory. The other people professions that I talked about a little while ago, which seem to be flirting with the awful thought of good enough practice, are like these. They are all concerned with the improvement of the human condition, and perhaps because of this, they share only one certainty: the knowledge that they will always end and lead to unsatisfactory results, unsatisfactory and unmeasurable results. This is what Gert Biester calls so evocatively the beautiful risk of education. The particular work that teachers do, though, as Connell says, is difficult to pin down because it involves an unspecifiable object of labour, a limitless labour process, and is in a sense unteachable. The one-to-many relationships of the teacher and her students highlights the importance of mediated relationships. And this relationality renders teachers' work at once intensely personal, invariably complex, and inevitably unpredictable. As our research on rural schooling, too, like Radford's, also shows, this is exacerbated by the need for teachers to be able to understand and engage with the larger social space that contextualises the lives of the students and the school and situates their practice. And as almost 10 years of retention studies show, many of those who leave teaching, who are actually what the British Education Department calls the system wastage, are suffering from emotional exhaustion, stress, and disappointment in their work. Published this year, Gabby Stroud's powerful evocation of the effects of the intensification of teachers' work, exacerbated by the requirements for performativity and measurement, highlights the immediacy of this. As she writes, trying to lay a blanket of standardisation over education shows a complete lack of understanding for the humanity required to do the job. In the everyday life of classrooms and schools, the effect of what Robert Persick called loss of feeling for the work among good teachers, brought about by lack of time for building quality relationships with children and young people, simply becomes too severe. Demoralising is Gabby Stroud's term. The work of teaching becomes administrative rather than relational. Now, planning to ensure that schooling is useful and rewarding for students and that new generations are well prepared to carry the nation into the future is the responsibility of government and of policy. But it is realised in and through the day-to-day work of teachers in classrooms. For policymakers in the 21st century, an education system designed and installed in the 20th century based on 19th and, I learned last night, way back to 17th century principles, means that there will always be failings in schooling from economic, social and political perspectives, as well as practically and programmatically. But there is a linear logic, and Marilyn Cochrane-Smith talked about this yesterday, expressed here in a United States position from about the same time that Radford was building his career here in Australia, that any problems with education can be sheeted home to teacher education as a matter of course. The idea of teacher education as the nail in the horseshoe of the nation remains powerful in research and commentary about teaching. Problems with education, schools and teachers are perceived to be most easily and readily solved by first blaming and then fixing teacher education. And because regulatory control needs to be measurable, the attraction of standardisation and the production of an ideal type of graduate, competent, proficient teacher as a solution to the problem means that the impossibility of success is actually built in. Within the terms of such a linear logic, though, we might say, and we can say on the surface, that teacher education in this country looks good. Professional, regulatory and university bodies have ensured that there is a line of responsibility that both precedes and comes after teachers' entry to the profession. The Australian Professional Standards for Teachers traces that line in measured steps from graduate right through to lead. And the new teaching performance assessment, developed from the very hard work of members of large consortia of universities over the last few years, will begin very soon to be used both in the assessment of new graduates and the accreditation of initial teacher education programs. As we all know, this requires that pre-service teachers successfully complete a rigorous assessment of teaching practice to ensure that they are classroom ready by graduation, so that the nation can indeed be assured that every single one of them is measuring up at the defined graduate level. But as Connell reminds us, such benefits come at a price. The standards framework embeds the neoliberal distrust of teachers' judgment. And even this is not enough in some jurisdictions. The New South Wales Education Standards Authority, for example, has produced something else, a teacher success profile that applies to all students commencing teaching degrees from 2019, and which it claims will set a new benchmark that university graduates must meet to be eligible for employment in New South Wales. This will help ensure that public schools only hire the best and brightest aspiring teachers. The rhetoric of only the best for public schools is uncontroversial. How could teacher education, any of us, fail to respond? But these 5 main criteria that graduates must satisfy to be considered potential public school teachers are written up there. And these criteria, of course, are the things that will now must drive curriculum in teacher education. As high-stakes assessment, this standardises and controls teacher education and its practice. And while the chair of TMAG might be able to claim, as he did just last Thursday to the nation, that the teaching performance assessment has solved the problem of teacher education in this country, the nature of education means that when solutions are adopted, they can only ever be temporary and conditional. Because the conditions of schooling will always continue to change, teacher education can never be good enough unless it is actually good enough. This is the crux of the impossibility paradox. Teacher education is linked to continuous dissatisfaction with the products of mass education. Change in the curriculum of schools, what teachers have to be ready to teach, is seen therefore as the most efficient means of achieving the changing needs of government. We've seen this occur almost in a textbook example with NAPLAN, and it's clear that the quickest way to change the language for talking about schooling is to change assessment. But when policy places greater emphasis on Bernstein's message systems of assessment and curriculum, the bits that Radford found back in the 1930s excluded the children of Bairnsdale and others who were different from the middle-class metropolitan norm. The relational dimensions of pedagogy are silenced. Curriculum and assessment can be controlled, but the pedagogy and practice that is essential if curriculum goals are to be realised must be practised, must be enacted in situated and always changing contexts, produced in the relationship of teacher and students. As Biest has argued recently in a book to be coming out next year, I believe, the idea of teaching as an effective intervention runs the risks of turning students into objects to be intervened upon, rather than engaging with them as human beings who are trying to figure out who they are and what this world is that they're finding themselves in. Like Gabby Stroud, Biesta is reminding us that transformation in the role of teachers brought about by recent policy agendas means that teachers are undermined and deprofessionalised, demoralised by the language of policy and performativity. In the USA, we heard yesterday, the situation is probably even worse. Private providers have entered the teacher education marketplace, offering lower cost, cheaper teacher education for those of the 3.6 million teachers who can't afford a high quality education. This is what Zeichner was getting angry about in the exchange I shared earlier. The move to inadequate forms of initial teacher education that produce teachers with scripts, with a prescription for certainty about practice, but who lack the confidence to know that they have the capability themselves. Just like the mothers of the post-war baby boom, home alone with their babies in their new Laminex kitchens, the formulaic notions of good practice that they think they want are actually toxic, both to their children and to themselves, unlike the sense of inquiry and doubt that they actually need. The focus in pre-service teacher education needs to be on a deep understanding of education, of pedagogy and of practice, rather than on meeting standards that represent and replicate existing policy and assessment regimes. Teachers actually need the skills to concurrently prepare their students well for the narrow ambit of tests the government deems necessary and educate them for the world beyond the school in a way that is genuinely, deliberately good enough. In Winnicott's sense, the teacher needs to prepare and capacitate them to achieve the indefinable outcomes that are actually desired and needed for educational success. And it's for that reason that I argue the merit in accepting that the perfect teacher education is an impossible ideal, and making the claim instead that a good enough teacher education is what we need. In this way, we might move towards understanding and responding to Anne Phelan's question. In what ways might teacher education acknowledge the basic condition of human existence and in so doing deepen teachers' appreciation of the incalculability of action and the extent of the responsibility? Just as a good enough mother works to encourage strategies and dispositions in her children, allowing them to seek solutions for themselves, a good enough teacher education understands the value and implications of teachers being fully aware that they enter the world of teaching before they are fully prepared to teach. They are not yet ready to teach, but they are ready to learn as they teach. I do not apologise for the confluence of the maternal and the teacherly here. It's deliberate and it's powerful, valorising an embodied, intuitive and emotional feminine consciousness over a masculine rationality, codification and control is exactly Winnicott's point. However, Winnicott's representation of a good enough mother was quite predictably critiqued as excluding men. And it was therefore extended by Bruno Bettelheim in 1987 to become the idea of a good enough parent. Nicely, and of course, good enough fathers do exactly the same thing as good enough mothers. And it is these characteristics of a good enough parenting that I have adapted as most applicable for teaching. Gabby Stroud shows us that teachers' desire to respond to their students and the context of their work has always driven good teaching. And it has always driven also the educational research of practitioner inquiry for well over a century. But at the focus on students and the valuing of small-scale and particular inquiry rather than large-scale production of knowledge is unsettling for those needing the security of big data before they can trust what they see and know themselves. The large-scale data-driven knowledge production that has led to the dismissive condescension towards much teacher education research, even within our own collegiate, was always an appeal to a masculinist dream of reason that positions the unreasonable and feminine, the maternal, as lesser, as awful. The problem with the knowledge produced by teachers in practice is that they own it. They therefore don't need to buy it and they don't need to be given it. But for Dreyfus and Dreyfus, it is only this which can generate real expertise. The idea of a good enough teacher education, therefore, is firmly practice-based in a deep philosophical and pragmatic sense. It must challenge the idea that teachers can ever know exactly what to do and what is required of them until they are in the practice situation. That's why I see the goal of such a professional preparation as the development of humility, the personal knowledge that because we can only know part of what we need to do to be able to teach well, we need to find out about our students, about their circumstances, their place, before we can plan effective pedagogy. Some of you will recognise the lasting echoes of action research in that thinking. And this is where I return to Radford's own research as a teacher before he became a bureaucrat and forgot the lessons he learnt there. His place-based study of the students at Bairnsdale, the findings of which, like the work of many of my colleagues in the field of rural education, are too often overlooked by the mainstream. And so a good enough teacher education can be described overall as the study of teaching as an educational practice, developed in the dialectic between theory and practice. As Anne Kinsella and her colleagues in health professional education write, such an epistemology of practice reweights the balance between different sources of evidence and knowledge, placing an emphasis on practice such that practice is not merely the site for applying theory and research knowledge, but also a site for developing knowledge, experiential and tacit. This does require us to change our minds a bit about what teacher education might look like, and in so doing, it requires the sort of higher standards and revision of administrative methods that were seen as necessary following Radford's research in the 1930s. In terms of teacher training, these changes would take seriously the evidence of a recursive continuum of teacher learning that builds on, though deepening and queering, the codified linear progression in the AARE standards, recognising that teachers can never know all they need. Perhaps this continuum can be understood as overlapping modes of teacher education and represented as a process that aims to prepare novice and continually extend experienced teachers as they develop and refine their teaching habitus. Such a representation highlights the need for changing our mind about the boundaries of teacher education too, for universities and schools alike to take seriously the need for novice teachers to have a transitional space, in Winnicott's sense, where they can practice teaching before they are assessed on their performance. It would certainly require the New South Wales Government to change its administrative mind about the need for new teachers, as we saw earlier, to prove their practical knowledge and ability in every single practicum report. An emphasis on continuous teacher learning calls for integrated pre-service curriculum that will foster the critical reflexive capacity of pre-service teachers in collaboration with both practicing teachers and university colleagues, who are all focused on real and changing problems of practice. Such teacher education is a renewal as it draws together what Alex Moore sees as the three major approaches to or models of teacher education: the apprenticeship model, the training or the skills model, and the model of teacher education as reflective practice. All of these have served and failed individually to meet the changing needs of the profession and the state at different times. It's not surprising that none was a silver bullet on its own, but without the expectation that whatever emerges will be perfect, their synthesis can be what I'm calling good enough. The key objective is to benefit the students currently in the schools, with the focus on authentic problems of practice that continually arise in schools as they struggle day by day to achieve high educational outcomes for the students and the communities they serve. Pre-service teachers need the opportunity to observe and participate in the pragmatic intellectual work of schools, where they have to make explicit connections between observed practice, the policies driving practice, and the theoretical ideas that inform education. This is what I think Gert Biester is talking about when he suggests that an essential condition for the development of a realistic task perception and the understanding of the multiple dimensions in the teaching job is that student teachers study enough theory during their training. Thorough and critical mastery of research-based theoretical concepts and frameworks is a powerful way for them to be able to read practical situations in a more sophisticated way, as multi-layered and nested in the school as an organisation, situated in the wider policy layers of the educational system. The important thing is for new teachers to see that teaching is work that needs to be studied and practiced if it is to be learnt and renewed. Such thinking is based on the premise that good enough teachers have the capacity to continue to learn about teaching as they gain more and more experience. It recognises the fact that practice can never be fully predicted or controlled, and that classroom readiness is actually an attitude of inquiry rather than an already accomplished performance. What I'm calling good enough teacher education draws unashamedly in its conceptualisation on our study of rural schooling and the concept of rural social space. This foregrounds the idea that no matter where it occurs, whether it's in Bellevue, Burragoon or Bairnsdale, teaching something is always materially and historically situated somewhere at some particular time with some bodies, all of whom have taken very different paths to what Pat Thompson calls the thisness of practice. Teaching and learning arise and emerge in practice, and preparation for teaching is a synthesising practice working to orchestrate each and every new performance. Each time we enter a classroom, the particular environment will be slightly different. As Lucy Suchman reminds us, the evocation of Indigenous knowledge of situated practice among the Truk people north of New Guinea is crucial to this argument. For Trukese sailors, the amazingly complex work of navigation, which, just like for teaching, has been codified, plotted, and mapped out in Western thinking as a correct course to follow, is a situated practice, sounding very much like the way that Gabby Stroud describes what she is capable of doing, but is prevented from doing in her classroom today. The Trukese navigator begins with an objective rather than a plan. He sets off towards the objective and responds to the conditions as they arise in an ad hoc fashion. He utilises the information provided by the wind, the waves, the tide, the current, the fauna, the stars, the clouds, the sound of the water on the side of the boat, and he steers accordingly. His effort is directed to doing whatever is necessary to reach the objective. If asked, he can point to the objective at any moment, but he cannot describe his course. It's essential, I think, for us to accept that engaging with the importance of space, place, and history, as in the idea of rural social space and navigating in the context of where we are, means, among other things, acknowledging, like the Urulu delegates, that there are silences everywhere. The work of people like Lyndall Ryan and her colleagues who are recovering the Indigenous knowledge about places where schools are located in Australia means that such silences cannot remain unfilled. Responding to the conditions of the social spaces in which teaching and learning take place involves a clear understanding of the objective of education. This cannot be done without attending to the silences about place and time that have produced the social space in which teaching occurs. This is what our colleagues Lingard, Ladwig, Mills, Hayes, Luke, Gore and Christie called problematic knowledge back in 2001. And it's a sort of knowledge that teachers need to engage and grapple with in the supportive, transitional space of a teacher education, of a good enough teacher education, which encourages the student teachers to search for self in Winnicott's terms. The erosion of deep engagement with ideas in the preparation of classroom-ready teachers is deeply troubling to all those concerned with the future of the profession. The AARE standards, for instance, are so silent about theory that the word does not exist in the document. Words like strategies and requirements have taken its place. The danger of this is that our teachers will have no language to talk and think about the larger purpose and goals of education, no objective to steer towards as they are blown off course in the highly charted seas of curriculum and assessment. I've attempted today to make this argument as plurivocally as possible, taking up others' words to highlight the worry that what we have at present is clearly not good enough in any sense at all. We must be reminded about the centrality of teachers' roles, their agency and authority in the social action that creates good learning. Given that clearly there are not good learning environments in too many of the schools serving our most marginalised and disadvantaged communities, the need for teacher education to be good enough to ensure that teachers have the confidence to serve their children, other people's children, rather than simply follow the rules is imperative. Indeed, as Connell argues, Who better than teachers to know what is needed to create a good learning environment for children? Teachers have a collective responsibility here, and teacher education has a responsibility to support it. The sort of higher standards of training and revision of administrative methods that I argue are good enough are generated by the same concern with educational equity and social justice that Radford felt in his study. And in spite of what I do worry is the awfulness of this thought for government and policy, I don't think we can wait much longer to think it through and enact it. Part of the awfulness lies in the fact that, as Britzman says, awful thoughts invoke self-doubt and doubting others. As well as the worries teachers have that education is not synonymous with control and mastery, there's the other real fear that one might lose self-control and composure, and the crisis might overwhelm all efforts to make knowledge useless. And so I'm going to leave you with those last words. Let awful thoughts erupt. Thank you.